This presentation is about dependent case and pseudo incorporation in Wolof. So let me start by talking about two different views of case assignment. So on the one hand, we can have a case assigned by dedicated functional heads as schematized in 1A and 1B, where something like a finite T assigns a nominative case and a transitive verbs assigns accusative case. On the other hand, we can also have case that's not assigned by any dedicated functional head. Rather, cases like accusative case and ergative case are a consequence of a relationship between two DPs that have not been assigned a case yet. They are in a C-command relationship and they both belong to the same domain of case assignments. In that case, either DP1 gets the accusative case or DP2 gets ergative case. Now, each one of those views is also attached to a particular view of nominal licensing. For the first view, where case assigned by a dedicated functional head, case assignment is also responsible for nominal licensing. So if that dedicated head doesn't assign a case to a DP, then the DP fails to satisfy something like the case filter or some other principle. In the dependent case view, however, case and nominal licensing are dissociated. So the idea here is that case assignments doesn't have anything to do with how nominals are licensed. Potential empirical evidence in favor of this dissociation comes from a language like Icelandic, where a nominative case can appear even in the absence of a dedicated head assigning that case, thereby licensing that nominal. So in 3, we have a verb that assigns lexical case to the subject, and the object ends up with nominative case. The nominative case persists even in environments where there doesn't seem to be any assigner of nominative case, as in the ECM construction in 3b. In this presentation, however, I'll try to argue that nominal licensing and dependent case are actually not incompatible with each other. And the empirical basis of this claim comes from Suzana Incorporation in Wolof. So just to give a preview of the data, what you see for A is that a bare nominal in the object position, it has to be adjacent to the verb, so there cannot be a low adverb in between the verbal complex and the bare nominal objects. However, there are some circumstances under which these adjacency requirements can be sidestepped. One of those circumstances is the applicative construction in 4b, where you add an additional argument here. In that case, the bare nominal object doesn't have to be adjacent to the verb. So the idea here is that what this applied arguments does is to provide a case competitor for the bare nominal objects, so it can be licensed with case, thereby doing away with licensing via adjacency with the verb. So what is crucial here is that the addition of a case competitor for a bare nominal to be licensed. So let me talk about Suzana Incorporation in Wolof. So in Wolof, we have quite a bit of nominal morphology. So those nominals that appear with this morphology, I'm going to call them full nominals. And those nominals that don't have any of this nominal morphology, I'm going to call them bare nominals. Examples of full nominals are in 5. So I can say something like our defined to be, our fixed the car. We can also have a plural version of that, as in 5b, our fixed the cars. And we also have an indefinite nominal, as in 5c, our fixed some cars. But crucially for my purposes here, we can also say 6, our defined to, our fixed car. So here is our instance of a bare nominal. Those nominals, furthermore, have the distribution of pseudo incorporation. So what happens in pseudo incorporation is that a complex nominal, usually it has to appear adjacent to the verb. It usually cannot be a subject, and those nominals tend to be narrow scope indefinites. All of those properties hold of Wolof bare nominals as well. So 7 is a baseline example. The teacher read the poem loudly. So here the object is a full nominal, and the adverb and a low adverb like loudly, it can appear in between the verb and the full nominal object, or it can appear all the way to the end of the sentence. In 8, on the other hand, we see a bare nominal in the object position, and now the position of the adverb, so there are fewer possibilities for the position of the adverb. Now it can no longer intervene between the verbal complex and the bare nominal object. In other words, this bare nominal object has to be adjacent to the verb. So I'm going to call this the adjacency requirements. There are, nonetheless, some strategies to alleviate these requirements. So you can either add an argument in between the subject and the bare nominal object, or we can able move the object. So we can add an argument in between the subjects in the bare nominal objects in applicative, causative, and transitive constructions. So in 9, we see a baseline example of a applicative construction. So we see here that we can either say I will build the house fato, or 9b, I will build fato the house. So the lower two objects can appear in either order. Now, if the object, the theme argument is a bare nominal, we have exactly the same range of possibilities. So you can either say, I read a poem, my child, or I read my child poem. 10a is the expected order because the bare nominal object here really is adjacent to the verb. What is not expected is the order in 10b, where the bare nominal object is separated from the verbal complex by the additional applied arguments. And you can also doubly separate the bare nominal from the verbal complex in a causative construction like 11 by separating those two things from with the causal arguments and also an adverb here. Another way to sidestep the adjacency requirements is to able remove the bare nominal. So in 12, we see a baseline example where we have a full nominal in the object position, and that full nominal is furthermore modified by a relative clause. Now, this full nominal can still be separated from the verb by an adverb here. But lo and behold, if we have a bare nominal modified by a relative clause, it can also be separated from the verbal complex by an adverb, as you see in 13. If you're wondering why I'm classifying the nominal in 13 as a bare nominal, despite the presence of a relative clause, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Another type of able movement is focalization, as you see in 14b, where we focalize the bare nominal, and once again, it no longer has to be adjacent to the verb. So given this data, the questions that we might want to ask are those in 15. So why do bare nominals obey the adjacency requirements while full nominals don't? Why does adding an argument in applicative, causative, and transitive constructions allow the bare nominal to sidestep the adjacency requirements? Why does able movement have the same effect? And I think the most relevant question here is, what is there in common between adding an argument and able moving a bare nominal such that they both allow the bare nominal to avoid the adjacency requirements? And I think that's the most relevant question here, because there doesn't seem to be anything common between adding an argument and able moving some other arguments such that they pattern together in allowing a bare nominal to avoid the adjacency requirements. So in order to answer those questions, I'm going to follow a version of Brennan's analysis of nominal licensing. So that theory has 3 main ingredients. The first one is the definition of nominal licensing that we see in 16. So here we see that nominals have to be case licensed, and furthermore, case licensing occurs if a nominal is assigned case, or if the nominal is adjacent to the verb. The second ingredient is that case assignments happens in a dependent case framework. So as I saw briefly in the beginning, for this framework, cases like ergative case and accusative case, they're not assigned by dedicated heads. Rather, they're a function of the relationship between two DPs that have not been assigned case yet. They are in a C-command relationship, and they also belong to the same domain of case assignments. So these DPs, in those conditions, they're called case competitors. A couple of things to point out here is that C-command is necessary, but not sufficient, because if we had a structure like 17 prime, where DP2 C-commands DP1, but they actually belong to different domains of case assignments, DP2 and DP1 are not case competitors. And the second observation is that once you're done with a dependent case, then the remaining DP gets unmarked case like nominative. And the third and final main ingredient in Brennan's theory is a particular partition of the verb phrase. So in his proposal, the verb phrase contains a voice P where the subject is basically rated, and this is itself a domain of case assignments. And then we have a little VP and a VP, and this is another domain of case assignments. So now in 19, even though the subjects and the objects are in a single-minded relationship, they belong to different domains of case assignments, and that's why the subjects cannot act as a case competitor for the objects. Now, two predictions arise from this proposal. The first one is that if we provide a DP in the lowercase domain, so that's going to be a case competitor for the objects. So this object can be licensed with case, so it doesn't have to rely on the second alternative for licensing, which is adjacency with the verb. So the fact that the subject doesn't belong to the same domain of case assignments as the object no longer matters. The second prediction is that if we keep the number of arguments the same, but now if we move the objects to a position where the subject is visible, now they can be case competitors because they're going to be in the same domain of case assignments. So those predictions are all borne out in Wolof. So let's apply this theory to the Wolof data that we saw so far. So in 20, I'm repeating here the adjacency requirements that bare nominals in Wolof are subjected to, but full nominals are not. So I can interpret 20b as a consequence of the subjects and the objects not belonging to the same domain of case assignments. As a consequence of that, the object cannot be assigned a case, and therefore it can only be licensed by the second alternative, namely adjacency with the verb. So that's why this adverb here cannot appear in between the verb and the object. So if it does, then this nominal cannot be licensed. Now, two questions are in order. The first one is about unmarked case. So as I said a couple of minutes ago, any remaining DP that has not been assigned independent case, it's going to get unmarked case. So why does the bare nominal object not be assigned unmarked case so that it can be licensed with case, and therefore it wouldn't have to be licensed by adjacency with? So I think that actually arises, assuming because unmarked case is relative biased to particular domains. So for instance, nominative case is assigned inside a finite CP, while genitive case is assigned inside nominals. So so the bare nominal here remains inside the VP if the VP is not a domain where unmarked case, which unmarked case is not relativized to, then nominative case is not an option for bare nominals. An alternative would be to assume a hybrid system where a nominative case is actually assigned by dedicated functional heads. So the only type of agreement which could be responsible for the assignment of this case in Wolof would be T. So there is no object agreement. T, if it agrees with anything at all in Wolof, it agrees with the subject and nothing agrees with the object. So even in a hybrid system, unmarked case, that doesn't seem to be an option. The second question has to do with how bare nominals differ from full nominals. So all things equal, everything that I said about 20b should also apply to 20a. So the full nominal here should also be in a different domain of case assignments than the subject, so that the full nominal should also be licensed with via adjacency with the verb. So why is this not the case? So I think things are not equal here. And the reason is that full nominals, if they are indefinite, they can actually scope over the verb, as we see in 22. But if we keep the same verb and have a bare nominal in the object position, then this bare nominal has to be a narrow scope indefinite. So given this scope difference between full nominals like 22 and bare nominals like 23, I'm going to have the proposal in 21, whereby full nominals actually undergo objective shift, while bare nominals have to stay in C2, or they have to stay in a much lower position. So that's a Dissing style difference that is based on the scope difference that we see in 22 versus 23. So what I said so far is schematized in 24. So a full nominal like a book, if it's the object, it shifts to the edge of the lowercase domain, and being in an edge position, it's visible to the subject. So the subject now can act as a case competitor for the full nominal object. so that objects can be licensed with case, dispensing with adjacency with the verb. The bare nominal, on the other hand, doesn't undergo object shift because it's a narrow scope indefinite. So that's why it has to rely on adjacency with the verb. Now, what happens if we add an argument in the sentence? So the data that we saw for applicative, the transitive, and causative constructions is represented in 25, where the theme argument is a bare nominal. It can be adjacent to the verb, but it can also appear separated from the verb by the additional arguments. So these additional arguments are proposing that it surfaces, it appears at the edge of the lowercase domain. So it can act as a case competitor for the bare nominal object. So it can be licensed with case, which dispenses with licensing via adjacency with the verb. And we have something similar for a-bar movements. So for instance, in focalization, we can a-bar move the bare nominal object, so it no longer, it's no longer adjacent to the verb. So under fairly common assumptions, a-bar movements is successive cyclic. So we a-bar move the bare nominal to an intermediate position here, which is by assumption the edge of the lowercase domain. So at this stage of the derivation, the subject, even though initially it doesn't belong to the same domain of case assignments, after this intermediate step of a-bar movements, now these two DPs are in the same domain of case assignments, so the subject can act as a case competitor for the objects. So the bare nominal can be licensed with case, which once again dispenses with licensing via adjacency with the verb. We saw the data repeated in 29, where the bare nominal modified by the relative clause, it can also be separated from the verb. Now, why am I calling this bare nominal a bare nominal, even though it's modified by the relative clause? Once again, the arguments comes from scope. So a full nominal modified by a relative clause, it can scope above or below the verb want, as I say in 30 A and B. But a bare nominal under the same conditions, if it's a bare nominal modified by a relative clause, it cannot scope above the verb want, as I say in 31A. It has to scope below the same verb. In other words, a nominal modified by a relative clause without any nominal morphology, it still acts as a narrow scope indefinite. So that's why I'm calling this a bare nominal, even though it's modified by a relative clause. With that said, so I'm assuming here, following Torrance's work, a rating analysis of relative clauses in Wolof. So if the bare nominal is the head of the relative clause, it is base rated inside the relative clause. So here, there will be, once again, assuming that relativization is also successive cyclic, there is a point in the derivation where the head of the relative clause, now a bare nominal, it's gonna move to an intermediate position before it races out of the relative clause. And at this point of the derivation, the subject is going to be visible to the bare nominal object. It can then act as a case competitor for this bare nominal. And that's why, once again, this bare nominal can be licensed with case, which dispenses with licensing via adjacency with the verb. So to conclude, in this presentation, I answered the questions in 33. So why do bare nominals obey the adjacency requirements, while full nominals don't? So first of all, there is a object shift difference between those two nominals, which was motivated by scope differences. And bare nominals, they stay low. They cannot be licensed with case because the subject belongs to a different domain of case assignments. And that's why they can only be licensed via adjacency with the verb. Full nominals, on the other hand, can shift, which allows the subject to be a case competitor for them. And the most relevant question here is, what was there in common between adding an argument and a-bar moving a bare nominal, such that they both allowed the bare nominal to do away with the adjacency requirements? The reason is that those two independent phenomena, they make visible case competitor for the bare nominal objects. We either straight up add a case competitor for the bare nominal by adding an applied a goal or a cause argument in the sentence, or we a-bar move the bare nominal, and that so that there is a point of the derivation where the subject can now act as a case competitor for the bare nominal. So the analysis that I propose here is successful in relating these two initially independent phenomena. But the bigger picture implication of this analysis is that it doesn't seem to be anything incompatible between nominal licensing and dependent case. So dependent case was crucial in answering the last question that I just mentioned. What is there in common between adding an arguments and a-bar moving the bare nominal, so that the bare nominal doesn't have to be adjacent to the verb. But furthermore, this analysis also tells us that the presence of this case competitor is crucial for the licensing of the bare nominal. So that's why the further implication of this proposal is that there doesn't seem to be anything incompatible between a dependent case framework and the view that nominals have to be licensed anyway. So that's it. Thank you.